Airports were designed for movement. Rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, coffee machines hissing like quiet engines behind glass counters, the constant hum of people passing through a place that was never meant to hold them for long. Gate 17 was no different that morning. Travelers stood in loose lines near the boarding desk. Business passengers checked their watches. A mother struggled to fold a stroller while keeping her toddler from wandering toward the windows overlooking the runway. Near the edge of the gate area, a young nurse waited quietly. Her name was Emma Carter. She wore simple navy scrubs beneath a gray travel jacket, the kind hospitals issued to staff working late shifts. A hospital badge hung from a thin blue lanyard around her neck. Nothing about her appearance stood out. To most people, she looked like exactly what she appeared to be. A rookie nurse heading home after a long shift. Emma held a small carry-on bag at her feet. Her posture was calm, shoulders relaxed, breathing steady. She watched the slow rhythm of the airport the way experienced medical staff often watched hospital corridors, always aware, always quietly observing. Two businessmen standing nearby barely noticed her. "Flight's delayed again," one complained. "Welcome to commercial travel," the other replied. Across the gate, a volunteer physician wearing a conference badge chatted loudly with a group of passengers. His tone carried the confident energy of someone accustomed to being the most qualified person in the room. "I work trauma at St. Vincent's," he was saying. "If anything ever happened in a place like this, I'd be the one handling it." The small group laughed politely. Emma didn't react. She simply listened. A few feet away stood a man in dress navy uniform. His posture was straight, disciplined. His jacket displayed rows of service ribbons and a sealed trident pin that caught the overhead lights whenever he shifted slightly. Commander Nathan Cole was waiting for a connecting flight to San Diego. Most passengers noticed the uniform. Few understood what it meant. He stood quietly, scanning the gate with the relaxed awareness of someone who had spent years in dangerous places. But here, in an airport terminal filled with families and rolling luggage, he looked almost out of place. For a moment, everything was ordinary. Then the cleaning crew arrived. Two airport workers were rolling a large tempered glass display panel across the polished floor. The panel was meant for a new advertisement installation further down the concourse. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, mounted upright on a wheeled dolly. Nothing unusual, just routine airport maintenance. But routine can change quickly. One of the dolly wheels struck a raised seam between floor tiles. The cart jolted. The heavy glass panel tilted slightly. At first, no one noticed. Then the tilt grew worse. The worker holding the frame tried to steady it, but momentum had already taken control. The massive pane leaned forward. A nearby mother gasped. Her small child had wandered dangerously close to the falling panel. The moment stretched. A split second where instinct outran thought. Commander Cole moved. His reaction was immediate, pure training. He stepped forward and shoved the child backward toward her mother. Then the glass fell. The panel struck the ground with explosive force, shattering into thousands of fragments. A jagged shard the size of a hand punched through the officer's uniform just beneath his right rib. The sound echoed across the terminal. For a heartbeat, the entire gate area froze. Commander Cole staggered. His knees buckled. Then he collapsed onto the polished floor. Blood began spreading slowly through the dark navy fabric of his dress uniform. A quiet, heavy stain. Not dramatic. Just deadly. Passengers screamed. Phones appeared instantly, cameras rising as people began recording. Security officers shouted for space. The volunteer doctor rushed forward, pushing through the crowd. "I am a physician," he announced loudly. "Step back!" He dropped to his knees beside the fallen officer. Commander Cole's breathing was wrong. His chest moved unevenly. When he inhaled, the right side collapsed inward instead of expanding. The doctor's confident expression faltered. "Collapsed lung," he muttered. But something about the injury didn't make sense. The officer clawed weakly at the ground. His lips were already turning blue. The doctor pressed down on the wound instinctively. It made things worse. Air whistled faintly from inside the chest cavity. "Where are the paramedics?" someone shouted. "EMS is on the way," a security officer yelled back. But they were minutes away. and the man on the ground did not have minutes. The doctor hesitated. Protocol said not to attempt invasive procedures outside a hospital environment. He looked around for equipment that wasn't there. For authority he didn't have. For permission. That was when someone else moved. Emma Carter stepped forward. She set her carry-on bag down calmly beside the wounded officer. The volunteer doctor glanced up sharply. "Miss, please step back." She didn't respond. Emma knelt beside the injured SEAL and studied his breathing. Her eyes moved quickly, measuring rib movement, listening to airflow, calculating. Right lung collapsed. Air trapped in the chest cavity. Pressure building. A tension pneumothorax. If the pressure wasn't released immediately, his heart would stop within minutes. The doctor continued speaking, irritated. "Security already called EMS. We just need to stabilize." "Stop pressing the wound," Emma said quietly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried absolute certainty. The doctor frowned. "Excuse me?" She looked at him calmly. "You're forcing more air into the chest cavity." He blinked, surprised, then annoyed. "And you're?" Emma didn't answer. Instead, she turned toward the nearby duty-free kiosks. "2 wine bottles," she said to the attendant behind the counter. The young woman froze. "What?" "Glass bottles," Emma repeated calmly. "Now." Something in her tone made the attendant move immediately. The volunteer doctor stared in disbelief. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Emma ignored him. The bottles arrived. Without hesitation, she snapped the seal on one and emptied it onto the floor. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Then she broke the neck cleanly against the tile. The doctor recoiled. "Are you insane?" But Emma was already working. Her movements were fast, precise, controlled. She positioned the bottle opening against the wound at exactly the right angle, creating a crude, one-way chest vent. Air hissed outward through the bottle. The trapped pressure escaped. Commander Cole's chest expanded. For the first time since the accident, he inhaled sharply. The crowd gasped. His eyes fluttered open, and then they locked onto Emma's face. Recognition flickered through the haze of pain. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried a name no one at Gate 17 understood. "Commander." His breathing rattled. "Raya." Emma didn't react, but for the briefest moment, her expression changed. Behind them, the distant wail of approaching sirens echoed through the airport. Paramedics were finally arriving, but the man on the floor was already breathing again, and no one at Gate 17 understood what they had just witnessed. Not yet. The sound of sirens cut through the terminal like a blade. Within seconds, airport paramedics burst through the crowd, pushing a rolling trauma kit between them. Their movements were efficient, practiced, but when they reached the fallen Navy SEAL, they slowed. Not because of the blood. Because of what they saw. The improvised glass bottle device still sealed against the wound. Air escaping through it in faint, rhythmic bursts. One medic blinked in disbelief. "What the hell?" He knelt beside the injured officer and quickly checked the breathing pattern. The lung had reinflated. Not fully, but enough to keep the heart from failing. "Who did this?" he asked sharply. No one answered immediately. Dozens of people were still holding phones, recording. Some pointed toward the quiet nurse kneeling beside the officer. The volunteer doctor spoke first. "That woman interfered," he said, irritation in his voice. "She broke a glass bottle and..." The medic held up a hand, cutting him off. His eyes were still locked on the wound. "This vent saved his life." The words landed heavily. The doctor went silent. Another paramedic began carefully securing the improvised chest seal while the first medic examined the officer. "Sir, can you hear me?" Commander Nathan Cole blinked slowly. His breathing was shallow but steady now. "Yeah," he rasped. The medic nodded. "You're going to be all right. We're taking you to County General." As they lifted him onto the stretcher, his gaze drifted again toward Emma. She was already standing. Already stepping away. Just another passenger preparing to board her flight. The medic noticed the look. "You know her?" he asked. Cole's voice was barely audible. Rhea. The medic frowned. What? But the commander had already slipped back into unconsciousness. The stretcher rolled away quickly toward the waiting ambulance. Security officers pushed the crowd back. Phones were still recording. Whispers spread through the terminal. And suddenly, attention shifted. Toward Emma. The volunteer doctor stepped forward again, anger replacing the embarrassment in his voice. You can't just perform invasive procedures in a public space, he said loudly. Emma stopped walking. Slowly, she turned. I released pressure from his chest cavity, she replied calmly. That procedure requires proper equipment and certification, the doctor insisted. You could have killed him. The paramedic who had been packing equipment looked up sharply. No, he said. The doctor turned toward him. Excuse me? That technique was correct, the medic replied. Without it, the lung pressure would have crushed his heart before we arrived. Silence fell again. The doctor's jaw tightened. Well, that doesn't change the fact she shouldn't have attempted it. Emma didn't argue. She simply picked up her carry-on bag. My flight is boarding, she said quietly. And then she walked toward the gate. No one stopped her. The gate agent watched her approach with wide eyes. Ma'am, she said softly. Emma handed over her boarding pass. The agent scanned it automatically. But she hesitated before returning it. That man, you saved him. Emma gave a small, polite smile. He was lucky. The agent shook her head slowly. That wasn't luck. But Emma had already moved on. She stepped down the jet bridge, disappearing into the aircraft. Behind her, the airport was still buzzing with confusion. Videos were already being uploaded. Titles forming instantly. Nurse performs emergency surgery at airport. Navy SEAL saved by passenger with bottle. No one knew her name yet. But that would change soon. The aircraft door closed. Inside the cabin, the world returned to its quiet routine. Passengers placed luggage in overhead bins. Seatbelts clicked. The low hum of the engines vibrated through the fuselage. Emma sat in seat 23A by the window. She folded her hands calmly in her lap. From the outside, she looked exactly like what she appeared to be. A tired nurse traveling home. Across the aisle, two passengers whispered. That's her, one said quietly. The one from the accident. The other leaned forward to look. She doesn't look like a trauma surgeon. Emma stared out the window. Clouds drifted across the horizon. She had spent years learning how to disappear into ordinary spaces. Hospitals. Airports. Cities, streets. Places where no one asked questions. But today had been different. Today, instinct had answered before memory could stop it. The aircraft began taxiing. The captain's voice echoed over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 482 with service to San Diego. His calm tone filled the cabin. But Emma barely heard it. Her mind was somewhere else. Somewhere dusty. Hot. Far away from polished airport floors. A place where wounded soldiers bled into sand instead of tile. Where improvised medicine meant the difference between life and death. She closed her eyes briefly. 3 years. 3 years since she had walked away from that world. 3 years since the official reports had listed her as missing, presumed killed in action. That had been intentional. Her choice. Disappearing had been the only way to survive what came after the war. Now she was simply Emma Carter, or Ren. Amaris? Nothing more. Or at least, that had been the plan. The aircraft lifted smoothly into the sky. For a moment, everything felt normal again. Until a voice spoke quietly beside her seat. No. Emma opened her eyes. A uniformed air marshal stood in the aisle. His posture was respectful, but serious. Could you come with me for a moment? Several nearby passengers immediately fell silent. Emma unbuckled her seatbelt. She followed him toward the front galley without hesitation. The air marshal waited until the curtain closed behind them. Then he spoke carefully. We've received several reports about the incident at Gate 17. Emma said nothing. He continued. You performed a medical procedure not commonly taught in civilian nursing programs. Still silence. The marshal studied her face. You're not in trouble, he added. But Homeland Security flagged the footage. He hesitated slightly. And military command contacted the airport. That was new. Emma's expression remained neutral. What do they want? She asked calmly. The marshal exhaled slowly. They want to confirm your identity. Emma held his gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then another voice entered the conversation. From behind them. Identity confirmed. The captain of the aircraft stepped into the galley holding a printed document. He glanced at Emma with quiet respect, then handed the paper to the air marshal. The marshal read it. His posture changed instantly. He folded the document, then stepped aside. Understood, he said. The captain nodded once, then turned to Emma. Ma'am, he said quietly. You are cleared. The air marshal opened the aisle. No more questions. No accusations. Just silence. Emma returned to her seat. Passengers watched her carefully now. Something about the interaction had shifted the atmosphere. Across the aisle, a man leaned toward his phone screen, scrolling through new updates. Suddenly he whispered under his breath. What? The woman beside him looked over. What? He turned the screen toward her. A military forum had already begun analyzing the airport video. A still image of a man kneeling beside the seal filled the screen. Underneath it was a single comment. From someone using an anonymous military account. 4 simple words. That's Commander Rain. The woman frowned. Who's that? The man swallowed slowly. I don't know, he said. But judging by these comments. He scrolled further. Veterans responding. Speculation spreading. Confusion growing. Whoever she is, he finished quietly. She's not just a nurse. Emma continued staring out the window, watching the clouds drift by, as if she hadn't heard any of it. But far below them, the story of Gate 17 was already spreading. And somewhere inside a military hospital, a recovering Navy SEAL had just woken up. And the first words he spoke were, "Find her." By the time the aircraft carrying Emma Carter reached cruising altitude, the world outside the cabin had already begun asking questions. The video from Gate 17 spread faster than anyone expected. At first it appeared on social media short, shaky clips filmed by passengers who had witnessed the accident. Within minutes, thousands of people had watched a quiet nurse kneel beside a dying Navy SEAL and improvise a life-saving procedure using nothing but a broken bottle. But what caught attention wasn't just the act. It was the moment afterward. The whisper. The wounded officer's voice. Commander Rain. The internet had paused on that frame. Zoomed in. Replayed it again and again. Military veterans began recognizing something others could not. Not the nurse, but the technique. On a private veterans forum, a former Marine medic posted a comment. Civilian nurses don't perform battlefield thoracic decompressions with improvised pressure valves. Another replied minutes later. Only special operations medics are trained for that. A third message appeared. If that's really Commander Rain, then she's supposed to be dead. The discussion exploded. Across thousands of screens. Across military communities. Across agencies that rarely paid attention to viral videos. Somewhere inside the Pentagon, an intelligence analyst paused the footage on a single frame. The nurse's face. How? Focus. A woman who looked far too ordinary to have done what she had just done. The analyst leaned back in his chair. Then he reached for the phone. Sir, he said quietly. You need to see this. Meanwhile, at County General Hospital, the emergency trauma team wheeled Commander Nathan Cole into surgery. The improvised chest vent had bought him just enough time. The surgeon examining him shook his head slowly. Whoever stabilized this man knew exactly what they were doing. The assisting nurse nodded. The paramedics said a civilian did it. The surgeon frowned. No civilian performs a field thoracostomy that cleanly. He pointed to the wound. Look at the angle. Perfect. even under chaotic conditions. Find the person who did this, he said. I'd like to meet them. But someone else had already arrived at the hospital. Two men in dark suits waited quietly outside the operating room. They didn't wear medical badges. They didn't introduce themselves to hospital staff. They simply stood there, watching, waiting. One of them finally spoke. Has the patient regained consciousness yet? A nurse shook her head nervously. He is still in surgery. The man nodded once. We'll wait. They had been sent by a command that rarely appeared in civilian hospitals. Naval Special Warfare Command. And they had come for only one reason. The name the wounded officer had spoken. Commander Rain. Back on the aircraft, Emma remained seated by the window. The hum of the engines filled the quiet cabin. Passengers were whispering again. Some were scrolling through the same videos spreading online. But she ignored them. Her breathing remained slow, controlled, a skill learned long before she had ever worked in a hospital. A flight attendant approached gently. Ma'am, she said softly. Would you like anything to drink? Water, Emma replied. The attendant nodded. As she handed over the cup, she leaned slightly closer. You were incredible back there, she whispered. Emma offered a polite smile. Anyone with training would have done the same. But the attendant shook her head slowly. No, she said. Not like that. Then she moved on. Across the aisle, a young man suddenly gasped quietly. What? His friend looked over. What? The man turned his phone toward him. A news site had just published an article. The headline read, Mystery Nurse Saves Navy SEAL at Airport. Military sources identify possible Special Forces connection. The article included a still image of a man kneeling beside the injured officer. The comments section was already filling with speculation. Someone had posted a photograph from years earlier. A blurred image of a female officer standing among a group of special operations soldiers. Face partially obscured. Name blacked out. But the code name beneath it was still visible. Re. The young man glanced toward Matt. Then quickly looked away again. You think that's really her? His friend whispered. I don't know, he replied. But if it is, he swallowed. She is not just a nurse. Emma continued looking out the window. Clouds drifted past like quiet waves. But inside her mind, something old had begun stirring. Memories. Not? Rotor blades. The sharp smell of metal and smoke in desert air. 3 years earlier, she had stood inside a military operations tent while a commanding officer spoke the words that changed her life. Your file will be sealed. Your name removed from active records. Official status, killed in action. At the time, she had agreed. Not because she wanted recognition, but because disappearing had been the only way to stop what came next. Now, thousands of miles above the ground, she could feel the past catching up. Quietly. Inevitably. The aircraft's intercom chimed. The captain's voice filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we begun our descent into San Diego. Passengers began gathering their belongings. Seat belts clicked open. The quiet rhythm of landing preparations filled the plane. But Emma stayed still, watching the coastline appear beneath the clouds. She already knew what would be waiting when the plane landed. She had seen that pattern before. When a ghost appears in public, someone always comes looking. Inside County General Hospital, the surgery doors finally opened. Commander Cole was alive. Stable. Still weak, but conscious. The two men in suits approached immediately. The surgeon removed his gloves and frowned at them. Can I help you? One of the men showed a federal badge briefly. We need to speak with the patient. The surgeon hesitated. He just came out of surgery. This won't take long. Reluctantly, the doctor stepped aside. They entered the recovery room quietly. Commander Cole lay on the hospital bed, breathing through oxygen tubes. His eyes opened as they approached. One of the agents spoke calmly. Commander Cole. Cole studied them for a moment, then nodded slightly. Naval Intelligence, he said. The agent didn't confirm it. He simply asked the question. The woman at the airport. Paul didn't hesitate. A Mac Carter. The agents exchanged a glance. That's the name on her boarding pass, one said. Cole shook his head slowly. That's not who she is. The agent stepped closer. Then who is she? Cole looked toward the ceiling and spoke the name again. The name that had once moved through war zones like a quiet legend. Commander Rain. The room fell silent. Because 3 years earlier, that name had been buried in a classified casualty report. Officially dead. Mission loss. But the man in the hospital bed knew something the rest of the world didn't. And somewhere above California, the aircraft carrying a Mac Carter was already descending toward the runway, where military vehicles were quietly waiting. The aircraft rolled slowly along the runway as the engines powered down. Passengers stood quickly, reaching for overhead bags and jackets. Conversations returned in scattered murmurs, but an undercurrent of curiosity still lingered inside the cabin. Everyone had seen the videos by now, or heard someone whisper about them. The mysterious nurse at Gate 17. The Navy SEAL who called her Commander Rain. A Mac Carter remained seated until the aisle cleared. It had always been her habit. In crowded places, patients made it easier to disappear. But as she stepped into the jet bridge, she sensed immediately that something had changed. Airports had a rhythm. A background noise of rolling luggage, announcements, distant engines. Today, that rhythm felt altered. At the end of the corridor stood 3 figures in uniform. 2 Navy officers. And 1 man in a dark suit. They weren't blocking the hallway, but they were waiting for her. The passengers ahead continued walking past them without hesitation. Families, tourists, business travelers, none of them noticed anything unusual. But when a man approached, one of the officers stepped forward. Abbas, Carter. His voice was polite, professional. Emma stopped. Das? The officer studied her face carefully, comparing it to the photo on a tablet in his hand. Would you mind coming with us for a moment? Nearby travelers slowed slightly, curious but unsure. Emma glanced at the officer's shoulder insignia. Commander. She knew the rank well. She nodded once. All right. They escorted her down a quiet service corridor away from the main terminal traffic. No handcuffs. No confrontation. Just controlled, quiet movement. The man in the suit finally spoke once they reached a small security office. You caused quite a stir this morning. Emma set her carry-on bag down beside the chair they offered her. A man was dying, she said calmly. Yes, the man replied. And you saved him. He placed a tablet on the table and turned it toward her. The screen showed paused footage from the airport incident. Her kneeling beside the injured SEAL. The improvised chest bent. Every movement clear. You performed a battlefield thoracic decompression, he said. That technique is taught almost exclusively to special operations medics. Emma remained silent. The Navy commander folded his arms. Your hospital records say you graduated from nursing school 2 years ago. Another pause? That doesn't explain how you knew that procedure. The room stayed quiet. Then the officer leaned slightly closer. So let me ask the question directly. His voice was calm. But who are you? Emma met his gaze evenly. My name is Mac Carter. The officer exhaled slowly. That's the name on your paperwork. He tapped the tablet again. A different image appeared. Oh, Granny. A photograph of a small special operations unit standing in desert camouflage. One figure was partially visible near the edge. A woman. Face turned slightly away, but recognizable. The officer looked back at her. This photograph was taken during a classified operation 3 years ago. He paused. The officer in this image was listed as killed in action. Another pause. The code name attached to that file was Rain. The man in the suit watched Emma carefully, but her expression never changed. Finally, she spoke. That file was sealed. The room went still, because those words had confirmed more than any direct admission could. The Navy commander leaned back slightly. So it's true. Matt didn't respond. The man in the suit closed the tablet. You disappeared after that mission, he said. No debrief, no return to command. His tone softened slightly. And now you're working as a civilian nurse. Matt folded her hands calmly. I chose a different life. The commander studied her quietly. You realize that video is already circulating worldwide. Ness. People are asking questions. They always do. The officer sighed. You saved one of our most decorated SEAL commanders today. Matt nodded once. He saved a child first. Silence settled again. The man in the suit finally stood. Well, he said. That explains one thing. Matt looked up. Which is? Why Commander Cole refused to stop asking for you. Before she could reply, the door opened. A uniformed hospital courier stepped inside. He looked slightly nervous. Commander Cole is requesting her presence. The Navy officer frowned. He is supposed to be recovering. The courier shrugged. He insisted. Matt stood. Then we should go. The officers exchanged glances. After a moment, the commander nodded. Very well. They escorted her to a waiting vehicle outside the airport. A quiet military sedan. No flashing lights. No attention. As the car pulled away from the terminal, Emma watched the city pass by through the window. 3 years. 3 quiet years of anonymity. Of hospital shifts. Of pretending she was someone simpler. Now that quiet life was cracking open. But she didn't look afraid. Just thoughtful. The vehicle stopped outside County General Hospital. Inside the recovery wing, Commander Nathan Cole sat partially upright in his hospital bed. A chest bandage covered the surgical repair. The doctors had done their work well. But the man still looked pale. When Emma entered the room, his eyes opened immediately. Recognition flashed there, followed by something deeper. Respect. You always did have perfect timing, he said quietly. Emma walked closer to the bed. You shouldn't be talking yet. Cole smiled faintly. Still giving orders. Still ignoring medical advice. He chuckled weakly. Then his gaze shifted toward the officers standing near the door. They finally figured it out, didn't they? The Navy commander nodded. Seems the world might soon figure it out too. Cole looked back at Emma. They're already calling you a mystery nurse online. Emma shrugged slightly. People love mysteries. Cole studied her for a moment. Then he said something quietly. Something only a few people in the world would understand. You saved my life once before. Emma didn't respond. But the officers exchanged glances. Because they knew exactly what he meant. Cole looked at them. Afghanistan, he explained simply. The convoy extraction. One officer's eyes widened slightly. That mission was classified. Cole nodded. Exactly. Then he looked back at Emma. You weren't supposed to be alive after that. Emma held his gaze calmly. Neither were you. For a moment, no one spoke. Finally, Cole leaned back against the pillow. Well, he said softly. Looks like the ghost came back. Outside the hospital room, the hallway buzzed with quiet activity. Doctors, nurses, hospital administrators, all whispering about the woman who had just arrived under military escort. And none of them yet realized the truth. The quiet nurse they were about to question had once commanded some of the most dangerous medical operations on Earth. Hospitals had their own hierarchy. White coats, administrative offices, committees that decided who had authority and who did not. County General was no different. News of the airport incident had already reached the hospital administration before Emma even arrived in the recovery wing. By the time she stepped into the corridor outside Commander Cole's room, several people were already waiting. Doctors, senior administrators, and one very familiar face. The volunteer physician from Gate 17. Dr. Harold Whitaker stood near the nurse's station with his arms folded tightly across his chest. The moment he saw Emma, his expression hardened. That's her, he said to the others. Several hospital officials turned. One of them, the chief administrator, stepped forward. MS, harder. A man nodded calmly. Ness. The woman held a tablet filled with reports and paused recordings from the airport footage. We need to discuss your actions this morning. Behind them, the Navy officers watched quietly. They did not intervene. Not yet. The administrator continued. You performed an invasive medical procedure in a public space without hospital authorization. A man remained still. A man was dying, she said. That is not the issue, the administrator replied firmly. The issue is that you performed a thoracic decompression using improvised tools. Dr. Whitaker stepped forward eagerly. Exactly, he said. That procedure requires surgical instruments and proper trauma training. His voice carried the sharp edge of someone trying to reclaim lost authority. She could have killed the patient. The hallway fell quiet. Emma didn't argue. Instead, she simply asked one question. Did the patient survive? Whitaker hesitated. Ness. Then the procedure was effective. The administrator sighed. That is not how medical accountability works. Whitaker nodded quickly. She clearly acted beyond the scope of a registered nurse. The words hung in the air. Beyond the scope. Emma stood silently. Behind the group, the door to Commander Cole's room opened slightly. A nurse stepped out. He is awake, she said. Whitaker gestured toward the room. Well, perhaps the patient himself can explain what happened. The group entered together. Cole looked up from the bed. His breathing was steadier now. But his eyes sharpened when he saw Whitaker. You, Cole said quietly. Whitaker straightened. Yes, Commander. Cole studied him for a moment. You're the doctor who froze. Whitaker stiffened. I was following proper protocol. Cole looked unimpressed. You were watching a man suffocate. The room went silent. Whitaker flushed red. I was waiting for trained trauma staff. Cole turned his gaze toward Emma. And she didn't wait. No, Whitaker snapped. She ignored protocol. Cole nodded slowly. Yes. He looked back at the doctor. Which is why I'm alive. Whitaker opened his mouth to respond. But one of the Navy officers finally stepped forward. Doctor, he said calmly, I suggest we avoid criticizing the person who saved a decorated SEAL commander. Whitaker frowned. Regardless of military status, medical law still applies. The officer tilted his head slightly. That depends. Whitaker crossed his arms again. Depends on what? The officer reached into a folder he had been carrying. He placed the document on the table beside the hospital bed. Depends on her credentials. The administrator leaned forward. What credentials? The officer opened the folder. Inside were several pages stamped with classified markings. He slid one sheet across the table. The hospital administrator read the top line. Her eyes widened. Commander Mac? She stopped mid-sentence. The officer finished it for her. Commander Emma Hale. Whitaker frowned. That's not her name. The officer looked directly at him. It was. Silence filled the room. The administrator continued reading the file. Her hands trembled slightly. This says she was assigned to Naval Special Warfare Medical Command. Yes, the officer replied. Whitaker scoffed. That doesn't make her a trauma surgeon. No, the officer agreed calmly. It makes her something far more rare. He turned another page. Special Operations Combat Medic. Another line below it. Field Surgical Authority. Whitaker's confidence faltered slightly. That still doesn't explain. The officer interrupted. Dr. Whitaker, Commander Hale performed 247 battlefield trauma procedures during her deployment. He tapped the file. Under live combat conditions. The room had gone completely silent. Even the hospital staff had stopped moving. The officer continued. She trained SEAL teams in emergency thoracic decompression techniques. Whitaker blinked slowly. The administrator whispered the next line from the file. Recipient of the Silver Star. She looked up at Emma in disbelief. For medical extraction under fire. Whitaker's voice had lost its earlier certainty. But she's listed as dead. The officer nodded. She was officially declared killed in action after a classified mission 3 years ago. Cole smiled faintly from the hospital bed. Not dead, he said. Just retired. Whitaker stared at Emma. You never told anyone. Emma shrugged slightly. No one asked. The room remained quiet for several long seconds. Finally, the hospital administrator closed the file slowly. I believe, she said carefully, that this changes the nature of our discussion. Whitaker looked stunned. But she still broke protocol. The Navy officer turned toward him. Doctor? Whitaker hesitated. That? The officer's voice stayed calm. But protocol didn't save Commander Cole's life. He gestured toward Emma. You did. Whitaker had no response. For the first time since the accident at Gate 17, the man who had spoken with the loudest confidence now stood completely silent. Emma remained exactly the same. How? Fem posed, uninterested in the argument. Cole watched the exchange quietly. Then he spoke again. You know the funny part? The room turned toward him. She wasn't even supposed to be there. He nodded toward Emma. She was just catching a flight. He smiled slightly. And the world almost lost a good nurse. He paused. Because some people thought they knew better. The hospital staff looked away awkwardly. Whitaker said nothing. And for the first time since the accident, everyone in the room finally understood something important. The quiet nurse they had dismissed had been the most experienced battlefield medic any of them would ever meet. The hospital room remained silent long after the file had been closed. The information inside it had shifted the balance of the entire conversation. Moments earlier, Anna Carter had been standing there as a civilian nurse accused of reckless behavior. Now the same people were staring at her with something very different. Respect. Confusion. And, for some of them, embarrassment. Doctor, Whitaker cleared his throat awkwardly. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier was gone. Well, regardless, he muttered, the patient is stable now. No one responded. The Navy commander standing near the door watched him for a moment before speaking. Doctor, he said calmly. Whitaker looked up. Yes? I believe the correct phrase here would be thank you. Whitaker's face reddened slightly. But before he could answer, Commander Nathan Cole shifted in the hospital bed. His voice was still weak, but steady. I'll say it. The room turned toward him. Cole looked directly at Emma. You saved my life. Emma gave a small nod. You saved that child first. Cole smiled faintly. Guess we're even. A quiet ripple of relieved laughter moved through the room. The tension that had been building since the airport incident finally began to loosen. But the Navy officer stepped forward again. Commander Hale, he said. The name sounded unfamiliar in the hospital room. Emma looked up. Nas? The officer opened the folder again. There is one more matter. The room grew quiet once more. He slid a single document across the table toward her. This is an official consultation request from Naval Special Warfare Command. Emma didn't touch it. What kind of consultation? Medical training. The officer's tone was respectful now. Our field medics are some of the best in the world. He paused. But many of them were trained using techniques you developed. Emma raised an eyebrow slightly. That was a long time ago. The officer nodded. Yes? He looked around the room briefly before finishing his sentence. But yesterday proved something. Emma waited. The officer met her eyes. You never stopped being the person who created those techniques. Commander Cole chuckled softly. He's right. He gestured weakly toward the door. Every medic I know would give anything to learn from the person who kept half our teams alive. Whitaker shifted uncomfortably in the corner of the room. For the first time, the man who had criticized her earlier looked almost small. The hospital administrator stepped forward quietly. Ms. Carter, she said. Her tone had changed completely. If you ever wish to teach emergency trauma techniques here. She hesitated. Our hospital would be honored. Emma looked around the room. at the Navy officers, at the hospital staff, at the recovering SEAL commander. 3 different worlds, all waiting for her answer. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then she finally picked up the document on the table. She read it carefully. An offer to return to military consultation. To train the next generation of special operations medics. To step back into the world she had walked away from 3 years earlier. Emma folded the paper slowly. The room watch. What if I said no? She asked. The Navy officer didn't hesitate. Then nothing changes. He gestured toward the hospital hallway. You remain Emma Carter, civilian nurse, free to live your life however you choose. The room stayed quiet. Finally, Emma smiled slightly. What? The officer raised an eyebrow. What? Emma nodded. Because I already have a job. Whitaker looked confused. You mean nursing? Emma turned toward him calmly. Ness? She glanced down the hospital corridor where patients and nurses moved through the quiet halls. People need help here too. Cole laughed softly. Figures. He shook his head slightly. The legendary Commander Rain chooses hospital shifts over war zones. Emma met his gaze. War zones are where I learned medicine. She paused. But hospitals are where people come to live. The Navy officer studied her for a moment. Then he smiled. Fair enough. He picked up the consultation document again. We'll leave the offer open. Emma nodded politely. Thank you. The officer closed the folder. Besides, he added quietly, it's probably better if the world keeps believing you're just a nurse. Emma allowed herself a small laugh. That was always the plan. Across the room, Dr. Whitaker slowly stepped forward. His posture was no longer defensive, just humbled. MS Carter, he said quietly. Emma looked at him. Nath? He hesitated, then spoke the words he should have said hours earlier. I'm sorry. Emma studied him for a moment. Then she nodded. Next time, she said gently. Don't wait for permission when someone's dying. Whitaker nodded quickly. I won't. Commander Cole leaned back against his pillow. Well, he said with a tired grin. Guess Gate 17 turned into quite the story. Emma picked up her carry-on bag from the chair beside the bed. Stories fade, she replied. Cole shook his head slowly. Not this one. Emma walked toward the door. Just before leaving, she paused. The Navy officer called after her. Commander. She stopped. Slowly turned back. The title still sounded strange after so many quiet years. Das? The officer gave a small salute. Not formal. Just respectful. Thank you for your service. Emma returned the gesture with a small nod. Then she stepped into the hallway. And just like that, she disappeared back into the ordinary rhythm of hospital life. A nurse among nurses, helping patients, checking charts, walking quiet corridors. Most people who passed her that day had no idea what had happened at Gate 17, or what names soldiers once whispered on distant battlefields. But sometimes, the greatest heroes are the ones who choose not to stand in the spotlight. The ones who quietly go back to work the next day, saving lives, one patient at a time. And somewhere in a hospital room upstairs, a Navy SEAL commander was alive to tell the story, all because a rookie nurse refused to stand back and watch someone die. If this story moved you, remember that heroes don't always wear medals where the world can see them. Sometimes they wear scrubs. Sometimes they stand quietly in a crowded airport. And sometimes, they save a life when everyone else hesitates. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and comment what you would have done.